crimson window flashed above the newborn's face. A strange old woman read 3 words aloud, and the mother burst into tears. Critical error, class not defined, entity is non-viable. And the baby in swaddling clothes thought the only thought his brain, overloaded with 2 lives, was capable of. It was an error message. He had seen thousands of them. Daniel So, 29 years old, back-end developer. The last thing he remembered was the blue screen of the monitor and ticket number 4073, which he never closed. And now he was lying on something wooden and couldn't move a hand or a foot. His hands were the size of baby sausages. He was born, again. And in this world, every person received a status window from the system at birth. Class, characteristics, skills, growth scale. This was not a game interface. It was the law of reality, like gravity. The priests of the calibration church taught that the system's lines were sacred and beyond question. The aristocracy was built on pure classes. Marriages were arranged based on parameter compatibility. Kingdoms were established for rare class lines. Everything went through the interface. Everything was measurable. Everything was recorded. And a person with a broken status was considered a flaw in the universe. They pitied him. They isolated him. They forgot him. Dan became exactly that, a cursed villager, the backwater of Vesper, 30 houses on the edge of the kingdom. His father's farm yielded just enough to keep them from starving. His mother looked at him with a guilt she couldn't hide. His older brother received the warrior class and left for the city when Dan was 6. He never wrote once. Dan grew up quietly. No master would take a classless person as an apprentice. The army was off limits. The academy was off limits. He couldn't marry under a system contract. He could till the soil with his hands because that didn't require a class. And he toiled for 19 years. Every morning he woke up and saw a red, flashing window above him. Critical error. Class not defined. Entity non-viable. Every morning he closed it with a wave of his hand, like an annoying notification. And every day the world reminded him that he was not a human, but an error. Children did not play with him. Adults talked over his head. Merchants did not make deals with him because, by law, a classless individual does not make deals. Once a year, the priest came to inspect the initiated. He looked at Dan's window. He shook his head. He wrote a single word in the register. Defective. And then, the night of his coming of age arrived. At 19, the final calibration, the last chance. The priest performs the final ritual over the status window. If a class does not manifest, the person is officially and permanently declared unviable. They are struck from the registry. He ceases to be a citizen. The priest arrived in the afternoon. He read a prayer. He touched the window with a ritual staff. The window flickered and remained crimson. The priest shook his head. His mother turned away. His father went out into the field. And Dan sat on the porch and watched the sunset, and for the first time in 19 years, realized there was nothing left to wait for. That night, he climbed onto the barn roof, alone. The village slept below. Above hung the stars of a foreign sky that had never become his own, and before him hung the crimson window. It was flickering, as always. He stared at it, and that night, something inside him broke, or perhaps it fell into place. He watched the blinking and suddenly saw it differently, not as a sentence, not as a curse, as a window of error. That very blinking he had caught 1,000 times on his monitors at 3 in the morning. An open process, a frozen render, an exception that no one caught. For 19 years he thought it was fate, that he had been poorly assembled, but it was just a mistake, a line that falls into an infinite loop. And he knew how to read it. His hands moved before his brain gave the command. He reached his fingers toward the window, not toward the surface, inside, to a place no one in this world had ever ventured, because no one suspected you could get in there. His fingers passed through the light, and he saw the code, lines, variables, functions, flags, comments in a language that didn't exist in this world, but which Dan read as if it were his native tongue. His status window looked like a configuration file from the inside. Old, dirty, with a bunch of commented out blocks and empty fields. The class field was empty, not broken, not erased, empty, a blank slate, a template into which the system was supposed to write something at birth, but the write had been interrupted, like a transaction that had failed midway. Dan read his fate like an error log, and for the first time in 2 lifetimes, he felt no despair. He felt professional curiosity. He didn't go and write in God of the Sword or Archmage. He knew better than anyone that you don't mess with someone else's system with major edits. First, a minimal change, just to check if the entry worked at all. He found the skills field, empty. He created a single line, 1 skill, editor access. He saved. The window flickered, disappeared, and reappeared, but not red, pale gray, neutral. The class was still empty, but the skill had been saved. The system accepted the edit. Dan closed the window, opened it again. The skill was there. He lay on his back right on the roof, looking up at a foreign sky and smiling. For the first time in 2 lifetimes, he had fixed what was broken, even if it was only himself for now. The morning began with roosters. Dan woke up on the roof of the barn with a stiff neck, and the first thing he did was open the status window. Gray. Skill in place. Editor access. It wasn't a dream. He went downstairs, washed his face from the barrel, and headed toward the house. His mother was already in the kitchen. She didn't look at him. After the priest's visit yesterday, she was trying not to look at him at all. His father had gone out to the fields before dawn. Dan ate his porridge in silence and went outside. The village of Vesper went about its usual rhythm. 23 households, a blacksmith with a 4th-rank artisan class, a 2nd-class miller, a couple of farmers with a basic farmer class, and those who were even simpler. No ranks, minimal skills, quiet people at the edge of the world whom no one needed. Dan walked down the street and looked at the world with new eyes, literally new. The editor's access worked not only on his own window. He could see. A status window hung above every person's head. Before, he could only make out the color. Green meant everything was fine. Yellow meant a problem. Red meant an error. Now he saw deeper. Each window was like an expanded file, lines of code, variables, dependencies. He walked past the blacksmith Borg and saw his class from the inside. A 4th-rank artisan. Everything was clean. The code was neat. No errors or obsolete calls. A stable build. He walked past the miller's wife, a 1st-rank cook. Clean, too. A small, neat file with nothing superfluous. And then he stopped at a house on the edge of the village, old Marion's house, an herbalist, a former herbalist. 6 months ago, her potion maker class burned down. It just vanished. One morning she woke up and her green window had turned scarlet, class undefined, skills reset. For 62 years she had brewed potions, treated cuts and fevers and snake bites. She was the only healer for 3 villages, and in one night, everything was gone. The priest said it was the will of the system, and that she had to accept it. Marion accepted it. She started drinking. Dan stood by her fence and looked at her window. Red, flashing, just like his own had been yesterday. But now he saw the code. He opened Marion's window at the source code level, and froze. The potion maker class was there. All of it. Entirely. All her skills. All the recipes. All 62 years of experience. Nothing was missing. Just one line. A single line in the file header. The activity flag. It had been set to 0. As if someone had simply turned it off. Not deleted. Not erased. Just flipped a single bit. Dan blinked. He looked again. Definitely. It was like discovering the server had gone down not because of a disaster, but because someone had accidentally flipped the switch. 62 years of expertise turned off by a single flag. He pushed open the gate. Marion was sitting on the porch, a bottle nearby. Her eyes were empty. She looked at Dan and turned away. A nobody. What did he want here? Dan sat down next to her. He didn't know what to say. In his past life, he hadn't been very good at talking to people. In this life either. So he simply reached out and touched her wrist. Marion flinched, but she didn't pull away. Dan closed his eyes and concentrated. Her status code unfolded before him. He found the line with the flag. He replaced the 0 with a 1. One change, minimal, like correcting a typo in the config. He saved it. Above Marion's head, the window flashed, the red light went out, and a green one lit up. Class, alchemist, rank, master, skills, all in place, all 62 years. Marion froze. She looked at her window, then at her hands, then back at the window. Then she cried. Not quietly, loudly, the way people cry who held on for 6 months and finally broke down, but in the opposite direction. She grabbed Dan by the shoulders and shook him, saying something, but her words were drowned out by her sobs. Dan sat and waited, and felt a strange thing. Warmth. Not from the touch, from within. For the first time in 2 lifetimes, he had fixed something that really mattered. Not a server, not a database, not some stranger's startup that would shut down in 6 months. A person. When Marion calmed down, she asked what he had done. Dan said he didn't know, that he'd just touched her window and it had started working. Marion didn't believe him, but she didn't press the issue. She wanted to believe in a miracle too much to ask questions. Dan went home and thought about it on the way. The edit was tiny, a single bit, but even from that he felt something, a slight vibration, as if the world had noticed the change, as if something had clicked somewhere far away. He didn't know yet that every edit leaves a trace, a diff, an imprint in the fabric of reality. A small edit, a small diff, but it's there. And those who can sense such things have already turned their heads toward the backwoods of Vesper. For the next 2 weeks, Dan worked quietly. During the day, he plowed the field as usual. At night, he studied the code, his own, the village's code, the code of the earth beneath his feet. It turned out that the system permeated everything, not just people. Every object had its own file. Every patch of land, the weather, the time of day. Everything was code, old, very old, with comments that looked as if they had been written thousands of years ago, with functions that called other functions that called third functions, and there was no documentation anywhere. Legacy, pure legacy. A production that no one had maintained for God knows how long. And he began to notice bugs, not in people, in the very fabric of the world. Minor glitches. The grass in one section of the field grew 3 times faster than in the neighboring one, because the code for that section had the wrong multiplier. The well in the square sometimes gave bitter water, because the filtration function referenced a remote module. Rain fell strictly on schedule but sometimes skipped a day, because there was a rounding error in the counter. The world was full of minor glitches, and no one noticed them because no one saw the code. Dan fixed the little things. He corrected the multiplier in the field. His father was surprised that the harvest turned out better. He fixed the well. The village elder decided it was because of the new moon. He fixed the rain gauge. Everyone decided they were just lucky with the weather. Small fixes, small diffs. He learned to be invisible. Then he fixed the class for Old Man Gunter, a former hunter. The tracker class had reset to 0 3 years ago. Same problem. Activity flag at 0. Dan fixed it. Gunter cried. Then he fixed the miller's daughter, 14 years old. Class, sneezed, burned out 2 months ago. Same flag, same problem, same line. And that's what made Dan stop. 3 people, the same error, the same flag. This isn't a coincidence. Random bugs are different, but here there's a pattern. Someone or something was systematically shutting down classes of people, in the same way, like a script, like an automated process, or like someone's hand. Dan sat on the roof of the barn at night, looking at the stars and thinking. The heresy of decay. That's what the church called the wave of burned-out classes across Arkadion. They considered it divine retribution, punishment for sins. But Dan looked at the 3 identical bags and saw no punishment. He saw systematic interference. Someone was walking through the code of the world and turning people off. And that morning, a rider approached the village. The rider turned out to be a woman, a young woman in a traveling cloak on a skinny mare. Her hair was the color of dark copper. Her eyes were alert, tired. She stopped by the well in the square dismounted, and looked around the way people do who are used to assessing a situation in 3 seconds. Dan stood by the fence and watched her, and her status window. Green, stable, 3rd rank theoretical mage, specialization, flow analysis. But inside the code, it was interesting. Very interesting. Her file was neat, perfectly structured, with her own comments in the margins. She understood the workings of her status far more deeply than anyone Dan had ever seen before. Not at the code level, at the theoretical level. She understood that her class was a set of rules, that skills were functions, that parameters were variables. She didn't see the lines, but she knew they were there. Her name was Celeste Vane, and she had come to the backwoods of Vesper because 3 days ago she had sensed a shift in reality. Theoretical mages worked with the system streams at the level of formulas. They couldn't change the code, but the best of them could sense when the code changed, just as a seismologist senses an underground tremor. Most mages sensed only major changes, wars, catastrophes, large-scale church rituals. Celeste sensed everything. It was her gift and her curse. She felt the shifts as a physical sensation, minor shifts like a tickle, moderate ones like warmth, major ones like pain. 3 days ago, she was in the city of Olmar, 100 leagues from Vesper. She was giving a lecture on flow theory at the local academy. And suddenly she froze mid-sentence because she sensed something impossible. A pinpoint alteration, exquisitely precise, tiny, and absolutely pure. Not the rough interference of a ritual, not a chaotic surge of disruption. Someone had carefully and with a deep understanding of the matter altered a single variable in a single living status. Nothing like this had ever happened before, in the entire history of Arkadion. Then she sensed another edit, and another, each just as precise, each in the same place. Someone in the backwoods of Vesper was doing to the system what neither mages nor priests nor the church knew how to do. She dropped out of her lecture, saddle up, and rode for 3 days without stopping. Celeste spent 2 days in the village pretending to be a traveling scholar. She walked between the houses and asked questions, cautious ones, like the miller's business with his class. Is it true that old Marion got her potion-making class back? And what about Gunther? The village was small and trusting, and after 2 days, Celeste knew everything. 3 people with restored classes. All 3 had lost them last year. All 3 had gotten them back. No one knew how. The local priest hadn't come. The church hadn't interfered. A miracle. The villagers shrugged and thanked the system, and Celeste stood by Marion's house, looking at her window, her heart pounding so hard it hurt to breathe. Because Celeste saw what the villagers didn't see, a trace. The edit left the faintest trace in the stream, like a fingerprint. And that fingerprint was on all 3 windows, the same one. She found Dan on the 3rd day. He was in the field, plowing, as always. A classless boy in a dirty shirt. She walked up and stood beside him and said nothing. Dan looked up and saw her status, and realized he had a problem. She spoke first. She said she knew that someone in this village was running the system. She said she could sense a trail and that it led to him. She said she wasn't from the church and that she wasn't going to snitch. Dan was silent. He stood in the field, holding a hoe, trying to decide what to do. Lie, run, or trust her. He looked at her code again and saw something, deep within her file, an old entry, a note, made not by the system but by a human, a priest. The note read, "Subject demonstrates heretical theories regarding the nature of the system. Isolation from the academic community recommended. Career blocked by decision of the Calibration Council." They broke her, not the system, people. She put forward theories that the system was not a divine gift, but a mechanism, a set of rules, a code, and they destroyed her for it, expelled from the academy, declared a heretic, her class advancement blocked. For years she wandered the outskirts, living off occasional lectures, thinking she had gone mad, that her theories were nonsense, that the priests were right and she was wrong. Dan lowered his hoe, looked her in the eyes, and said she had been right from the very beginning. The system is code. He sees it, he controls it, and if she wants, he can show her. Celeste Vane stood in the middle of a field in muddy hiking boots and cried. silently, only tears, not a sound, like a person who had carried a stone inside for 12 years and finally let it fall. Dan stood beside her and didn't know what to do with the crying woman. In this life, just as in the last. Then she wiped her face and said she wanted to see everything. That evening, Dan showed her. They were sitting in the shed. He opened his status window at the code level. Celeste couldn't see the lines of code, but she saw how he interacted with the window, how his fingers delved into the interface, how streams flickered with every touch. She asked questions, dozens of questions. Structure, syntax, call hierarchy, variable types. Dan answered as best he could. He translated from the language of a programmer into the language of a theorist. She caught on immediately. She was incredibly smart. 2 hours later, she articulated what Dan felt, but couldn't express in the words of this world. A system isn't a law of nature. It's an artifact, created by someone, long ago, and left unattended. Dan nodded. He said it was legacy code. She didn't understand the term, but she grasped the essence. An old system that no one fixes. And then she asked the crucial question. She asked if he'd heard of the heresy of decay, about the wave of burned-out classrooms across Arkadion. Dan said he had, and that he'd found something, the same pattern in all 3 broken classes in the village, the same flag, the same error, not a coincidence. Celeste turned pale. She said the scale was bigger than he thought. Not 3 people, thousands, across the entire continent, more and more every month. Entire villages were losing their classrooms overnight, and the church was burning the infected, not healing them, burning them, because it didn't know how to fix it. Dan was silent. He was thinking about what he'd seen in the code. The same pattern, systematic interference, not a bug. Someone is doing this on purpose. He didn't tell Celeste that, not yet, too soon, not enough data, but a thought was already forming in his head that sent a chill down his spine. Somewhere in this world, there is someone else, someone who also knows how to tamper with the code, and that someone isn't fixing it, they're breaking it. Celeste stayed in the village. She told the village elder that she was studying local herbs for an academic paper. The elder had no objections. A wandering scholar on the outskirts of the kingdom is nothing out of the ordinary. She settled into an empty house on the edge of the village and came to Dan's barn every evening. They worked, 4 or 5 hours every evening. Dan read the code. Celeste asked questions and took notes. She had her own language for describing the system, flow formulas, equilibrium equations, cascading interaction models. Dan translated what he saw into her language, and she translated it back into her own. Together, they understood the system more deeply than either of them could alone. He saw the code but didn't know the theory of the world. She knew the theory but didn't see the lines. Together, they were like 2 eyes on one person. A week later, they drew up the first map, not a geographical one, an architectural one. The structure of the system as Dan could see it. The core that governed the basic laws, the class module responsible for people's statuses, the skill engine, the magic processor, regional subsystems. All of this was interconnected by thousands of dependencies, and all of this was old, very old. Some modules hadn't been updated in thousands of years. Some contained commented-out functions with notes in a language that didn't exist anywhere in Arkadion. Dan recognized the style of these notes. They were the developer's comments. The one who wrote the system, the first architect. And he wasn't a god. He was an engineer. His comments were just like the ones Dan himself had left in the code in his past life. Workaround, fix later, crutch, don't touch until we figure it out, known bug, low priority. The world system was written like any major project, with workarounds and hacks and temporary solutions that became permanent. Celeste listened to his descriptions, and her eyes burned. She had been banging her head against a wall for 12 years, and now the wall had crumbled, revealing the universe beyond. She repeated, I knew it wasn't God. But the work was drawing attention. Every time Dan touched the world's code, he left a diff, a small one, but Celeste could sense it, which meant other theoretical mages could too, and someone far more dangerous. On the 12th day of Celeste's stay in Vesper, a boy came to the village. He was about 10 years old, dirty, skinny, hungry. He had walked for 3 days from the neighboring village of Crowhall. His village had lost its classes. All of them. Every single one. All 56 residents woke up one morning and saw crimson windows. Critical error. Class not defined. The boy's name was Thomas. He came because he'd heard that in Vesper, old Marion had regained her potions class. And he'd walked here alone for 3 days through the forest because his mother had been bedridden and hadn't gotten up since the day her class burned down, and his father had gone to look for a priest and hadn't returned. Dan sat across from the boy and listened, and looked at his status. Scarlet, flashing, the same pattern, the same flag, but not alone. Everything was turned off for the boy. Class, skills, even basic stats, a complete reset. Dan delved deeper into his code and froze. There was something the residents of Vesper didn't have. A tag, a timestamp in the changelog. A system message recorded neither by the architect nor by the system, recorded by a third party. The tag read, Purge complete, Node 47, Cycle 3. Dan read it 3 times. Purge. Not a glitch, not an error. Purge. Someone had deliberately purged 56 people and marked it as a completed task. He showed the tag to Celeste. He described it in words. She turned so pale that the veins on her temples became visible. She said it confirmed everything, that the heresy of decay was neither a disease nor a punishment. It was a process, initiated by someone, with a purpose. Dan fixed the boy, restored his flags, restored his class. Base class, Scout, first rank. The boy smiled for the first time in 3 days, but Dan didn't smile. He was thinking about Crowhall, 56 people. He could have fixed them, if he'd made it there, could have restored their classes, could have restored the flags, but that would have been a major commit, 56 edits at once, or if he found a way through the regional node, then 1 edit, but a major one, a very major one. And every major commit left a major diff, and a major diff wasn't felt only by theoretical mages. The church felt it, the calibration church. For 1,000 years they had hunted down those they called heretics of the text, people capable of touching the system, and they burned them, every single one, because the very existence of such people undermined the dogma of the immutability of sacred law. If someone can change the system, then the system is not absolute. Then it is not divine. Then everything the church stands on is a lie. They could not allow that. The church had its own specialists, readers, inquisitors trained to sense diffs, not as subtly as Celeste, more crudely, but over long distances, and if Dan went to fix an entire village, they would find him. Celeste told him this straight out. She said that if he made a major edit here, in a month, people in black robes would arrive and ask questions to which there were no right answers. Dan knew she was right, and he knew that in Crowhall lay the boy's mother, who wouldn't get out of bed, and 55 other people who've lost everything. He made his decision at night, sitting on the roof of the barn, as usual. He'll go to Crowhall, but he won't go through the regional hub. He'll walk, and he'd fix each one by hand, one by one, small edits, small diffs, stretched out over time. Not one big commit, but 56 small ones. It would take days, maybe a week, but it would be quieter. Celeste said she'd go with him. Dan said it was dangerous. She replied that she'd spent 12 years thinking she'd gone mad and had finally found proof that she was right, and that he could toil alone, but he wouldn't be able to fix the world by himself. He couldn't think of a counter-argument. They set out at dawn. Dan, Celeste, and the boy Thomas, who walked ahead and showed the way. 3 people on a muddy road in the morning fog. The beginning of something none of them could yet name. The journey to Crowhall took 2 days, through the forest along a path that only Thomas knew. The boy walked quickly. He didn't look back. He was in a hurry to get home. Celeste walked beside Dan and spoke quietly. She told him about the church, about the readers, about how the hunt for heretics worked. There were 3 circles in the calibration church. The outer circle, the calibration priests, the very ones who came to the villages and performed initiation rituals. They could read status windows on a superficial level: color, class, rank, skills, nothing deeper. The middle circle: flow analysts, magicians, theorists in the service of the church. They tracked major changes in the system across the continent, recorded anomalies, compiled reports. Celeste was once one of them, before she was expelled for heresy. And the inner circle: readers, inquisitors. Few knew of them. They could sense diffs, traces of edits. Not like Celeste, rougher, but purposeful. They were trained for this like hunting dogs on the scent of blood. If a mag theorist felt an edit as a tickle or warmth, a reader felt it as a direction. He could follow the trail, for months if necessary. Over 1,000 years, the Church had destroyed 17 confirmed heretics of the text, people who, in various eras, had discovered the ability to touch the system. Everyone was found. Everyone was burned. Records of them were destroyed. Their very existence was heresy. Dan listened and counted in his head. 17 in 1,000 years. About once every 60 years. Rare. But the Church didn't let up. They trained readers constantly, generation after generation, as if they were waiting for the next one. And here he is, right on cue, the next one, plowing a field in the backwoods of Vesper and teaching classes to old ladies. They reached Crow Hall by evening on the second day. The village was dead. Not literally. People were alive, but the village was dead. Houses stood. Smoke rose from the chimneys, but no one was on the street. Silence. No blacksmith's hammer. No creak of a cart. No children's cries. 56 people sat in their homes, without classes, without skills, without purpose. Thomas ran to a house on the edge of the village. Dan followed him. The boy's mother lay in bed, a thin woman with lifeless eyes. She looked at her son and tried to smile. She couldn't. Dan sat down beside her. He opened her code. The same pattern. Flag set to 0. But not only that. Here, the erasure was deeper than in Vesper. Not just flags turned off. Connections between skills erased. Dependencies severed. Someone hadn't just turned off her class. Someone had started taking it apart. Like they're demolishing a building, methodically, from top to bottom. If a few more weeks had passed, nothing would have remained of her class. There wouldn't even have been anything left to restore. Dan worked for 3 hours, restoring connections, one by one, like he was sorting through the wiring in an old house. Every wire in its place, every connection checked, every dependency hooked up. Celeste sat beside him and took notes in silence. She couldn't see the code, but she felt his every move, every edit. She said later that it was like listening to music performed by a virtuoso. He didn't have any music in it. He saw debugging. Thomas's mother opened her eyes. A green window glowed above her. Class, seamstress, rank, apprentice, skills, all in place. She sat up in bed and looked at the window, then at her son, and pulled him close, holding him for a long time. Dan went outside. Next house, next person, next 3 hours of work. He'd been fixing Crow Hall for 4 days, 12 to 14 hours a day. Got up at dawn, went into the house, sat down next to the person, opened the code, worked, moved on to the next one. Celeste helped as best she could, kept an eye on his condition. She made him eat, she made him drink, she made him sleep for at least 6 hours. Each fix was small, each diff was quiet, but there were many of them, and they came one after another, day after day. By the end of the 4th day, 43 out of 56 people had been fixed. 13 remained, the hardest cases, those whose cleansing had gone the furthest, whose connections weren't just disconnected, but had begun to disintegrate. Dan sat on the porch of Thomas's house on the evening of the 4th day. His hands trembled with exhaustion. His head was buzzing. He closed his eyes and saw lines of code on the inside of his eyelids. Celeste sat down next to him. She was silent. Then she said she sensed something, far away, to the south, movement, as if someone very heavy had turned toward them. Dan opened his eyes. He asked the reader. She said she didn't know. Maybe the reader, maybe else. But something in the south had sensed their work. Their 4 days of non-stop edits, 43 small diffs, individually unnoticeable, but together Together they formed a pattern that was impossible to miss. Dan cursed inwardly. He had been so focused on his work that he had forgotten a simple thing. 43 small commits to a single branch over 4 days. Any monitoring system would have raised an alarm. Any senior developer would have seen the pull request in the log and asked what was going on. And the church had its own seniors and its own logs. He looked at the 13 remaining houses. 13 people. The hardest cases. The longest fixes. If he stayed another 2 or 3 days, if someone was actually coming. Celeste said they had time. Maybe a week. Maybe 2. Readers don't teleport. They have to get there physically. And Vesper and Crow Hall are far from the main roads. Dan nodded. He stood up. He walked to the next house. 13 people. He would finish, whatever the cost. The next 2 days were the hardest. The difficult cases required more than just flipping flags. They required the restoration of entire blocks of code, a restructuring of the skill framework. Sometimes he found pieces of code that hadn't just been erased, but overwritten, replaced with something else, empty placeholders, as if whoever performed the cleanup hadn't just deleted the data, but also filled the void so the system wouldn't throw an error. Professional work. Whoever did this knew what they were doing. It wasn't a script, not an automated process. It was manual work. Someone had manually dismantled the classes of 56 people, carefully, methodically, with an understanding of the architecture, the second editor. Dan no longer had any doubts. Somewhere in this world, there was another person with access to the code, and this person was doing the exact opposite, not fixing, taking apart. He finished the last one on the 6th day, the old fisherman, the fisherman class, master rank, fully restored, 56 out of 56. The village came back to life, the blacksmiths hammering again, the creaking of carts again, children's voices in the street again. People didn't know who had fixed them. Thomas knew. His mother knew. They kept quiet. Dan asked them to keep quiet, and they obeyed. Dan stood on the outskirts of Crow Hall and looked at the village, and he felt the same vibration as after the first edit, only stronger, much stronger. 56 edits, 56 diffs, quiet individually, deafening together. Celeste approached. Her face was serious. She said that the movement in the south had intensified, that it was closer, and that it wasn't just one person, several. They were moving fast, purposefully. Dan nodded. Time to go. They left at dawn on the 7th day, the 3 of them, Dan, Celeste, and Thomas, whom his mother had let go with them because she understood. With this strange, classless guy, her son was safer than in the village where the one who had broken them could return. They were heading north, through the forest, no road, fast and quiet, like people who know they're being followed. The forest north of Crow Hall was old. The trees stood so thickly that the sun broke through only in patches. There was no trail. Thomas walked ahead and found passages between the trunks. The boy had grown up on these outskirts and knew the forest better than any map. Dan followed him and thought. Celeste brought up the rear. She had been silent for the past 2 hours. This was unusual. Usually she talked non-stop, asked questions, formulated theories, argued with herself. Now she was silent. Dan turned around. She was walking with her eyes closed. With one hand, she touched the tree trunks so she wouldn't bump into them. With the other, she pressed her fingers to her temple. She was listening, not with her ears, with that sense that allowed her to perceive shifts in reality. An hour later, she stopped and opened her eyes. She said there were 3 of them, 3 readers, coming from the city of Olmar, 2 days behind them, maybe 3, moving fast. They have horses, and they know exactly which way to go. Dan asked where such precision came from. Celeste explained. Readers sense diffs as direction and distance, but she senses the readers, because they themselves are an anomaly in the flow. Every reader carries the imprint of hundreds of other people's diffs that they've tracked down over their career. They're like walking archives of other people's edits, and this archive is buzzing. She felt their approach as a growing noise. 3 days. They had a 3-day head start, maybe less if the readers found horses on the trail. She had to decide where to go. North, deeper into the woods. But the woods ended after 5 days' journey. Beyond them lay the foothills. Beyond the foothills, a pass. Beyond the pass, another kingdom. But it was 2 weeks to the pass. The readers would catch up sooner. East, the coast, the port of Revel. From there, they could sail away. But a port means people, documents, status checks. Dan has the status of a classless. Celeste has a heretic mark in her code. They'll be stopped at the very first checkpoint. To the west, the wastelands. Lands the system barely covered. Wild territories. Neither priests nor readers went there, but neither did people. Because without the system, the world became unpredictable. Monsters without statuses, weather without a schedule, a land without rules. Celeste said that heading west was suicide. Dan said that heading east was a trap. Thomas said that 2 days' journey to the north lay a city, the town of Thornwood. Small, a trading post. It stands at the crossroads of 3 roads. You can get lost there. There are many visitors, and no one checks documents because the town needs workers. His father went there to work every fall. Dan looked at the boy, 10 years old, a dirty face, serious eyes. This child had walked 3 days alone through the forest to find help for his mother. And now he was leading 2 adults through that same forest because they didn't know the way. They were heading north, toward Thornwood. They walked for 2 days. They spent the night in the woods. Dan didn't build a fire, not because he was afraid the smoke would be seen, but because he didn't know if fire affected the visibility of the diffs. He didn't know exactly how the readers tracked their trail. Celeste didn't know for sure either. She knew the theory but not the practice. The theory said that diffs dissipate over time. A small diff disappears in a matter of days. A large one lasts for weeks. But 56 diffs in Crow Hall would be glowing for another month, and every reader within 100 leagues would know where the one who made them came from. On the second day of their journey, Dan stopped. They came out into a clearing. In the middle stood a stone, ordinary looking, gray, covered in moss. But Dan saw its code, and the code was unusual. The stone was a node, a regional node of the system, one of thousands scattered throughout Arkadion. Through these nodes, the system distributed data streams across the territory, like a router. Each node served its own section, received updates, distributed statuses, logged changes. Dan placed his hand on the stone. The node's code unfolded before him. A regional server, old, overloaded, with a pile of unprocessed requests in the queue. Among them were his own diffs, 56 entries from Crow Hall, neatly logged, with timestamps, with coordinates, with a record of his edits, everything laid bare. Any reader connected to this node would see the full picture. Who, where, when, how many edits, what type. Dan looked at these records and thought. In a past life, he would have opened the logs and cleaned them out, would have deleted the compromising entries. But here, everything was more complicated. The logs were part of the system. Deleting logs is also an edit, and that edit would also leave a diff on a diff. A reader would see that someone not only edited the system, but also covered their tracks. That would attract even more attention, a vicious circle. But Dan looked at the node's code and saw something else. The logging structure, how diffs are recorded, where they're sent, via which protocol. And he saw that the protocol was full of holes. The ancient logging mechanism hadn't been updated in thousands of years. It had vulnerabilities, not bugs, architectural weaknesses, places where data could be lost not because someone deleted it, but because the system itself couldn't handle the load. Dan didn't delete the logs. He did something smarter. He found the node's processing queue. He found the prioritization mechanism, and he added a load. Not his own, someone else's. He took data on the system's routine daily processes and copied it into the queue. Hundreds of entries, thousands, ordinary noise, weather updates, grass growth, animal migration. All that background code the system processed every day. He flooded the queue with noise, and in that noise, his 56 diffs were lost, not gone, drowned, like a needle in a haystack. The reader could have found them, if he'd known what to look for, if he'd sat down and gone through every record by hand, but that would have taken days, and they had a 3-day head start. Celeste stood beside him and looked at him with an expression he couldn't read. Then she said that he'd just outsmarted the system using its own methods, that it was the most beautiful thing she'd ever seen. Dan shrugged. He said that it wasn't cheating, it was a stress test. They moved on. It was a day's walk to Thornwood. Thomas walked ahead, confidently. This boy knew the woods like the back of his hand. Dan followed behind and thought about what he'd seen in the node. Not his logs, something else. Among the thousands of entries in the node's queue, he'd noticed something else. Old diffs. Not his, someone else's. Cold, neat. No fingerprint, as if whoever made them knew how to edit the system without leaving a trace, or leaving almost none. The diffs of the second editor. He recognized the handwriting, the same style as in Crowhall, the same methodical approach, the same placeholders. But these entries were older, much older. Months, years. The second editor had been at work for a long time, long before Dan learned to read the code, long before the heresy of decay became apparent. He methodically and quietly took the world apart, piece by piece, and no one noticed, because no one could see the code, except Dan. Now, except Dan. Thornwood stood in a valley between two hills, a city at the crossroads of 3 roads. The western one led to the coast, the eastern one to the capital, the northern one to the foothills. Caravans passed through the city, merchants, mercenaries, artisans in search of work, wandering mages, adventurers. The city thrived on transit and didn't give a damn who you were, as long as you were spending money or earning it. They entered the city through the northern gate. The guard looked at them indifferently. A classless guy, a female mage, a boy. Ordinary travelers. No one asked for their status. No one checked the windows. Thomas was right. Dan took the last few coins from the purse his mother had given him before leaving. It was enough for a room above the tavern for 3 nights. A small one, with a single bed and a straw mattress on the floor. Thomas fell asleep instantly. Celeste sat by the window and looked out at the city. Dan lay down on the mattress and closed his eyes, but he couldn't sleep. He was thinking about the money they didn't have, about the readers who were coming after them, about the second editor, about the 56 people he had fixed, and about the thousands he hadn't. The heresy of decay was spreading across the continent. Thousands of people were losing their classes. The church was burning them instead of healing them, and he was alone, with 2 hands and 1 skill. In the morning, he went out into the city, without a plan, with a need. They needed money, food, shelter for more than 3 nights, and he needed information about the scale of the heresy, about the church, about what was happening in the world beyond the backwoods of Vesper. Thornwood gave him everything at once. In the market square, he overheard conversations. Merchants from the eastern provinces were complaining about falling sales. Entire cities were losing their artisans. Not because people were leaving, but because their classes were burning away, and they could no longer work. A blacksmith without a class could not forge, not physically. Physically, he could, but the system blocked access to his skills. His hands remembered the movements, his muscles remembered the effort, but without an active class, the system produced no result. Metal would not take shape, fabric would tear, potions would not brew. The system was not merely an interface, it was the operating environment. Without it, the world didn't function, and it was breaking down, faster than anyone wanted to admit. A platform stood in the square. On the platform, a priest, the outer circle, the calibrator. He read the church's decree. The decree stated that the heresy of decay was punishment for straying from the true faith, that the system punishes sinners, that salvation lies only in prayer and submission, that all who have lost their class must report to the nearest temple for a calibration trial. Dan looked at the priest and his status. Class, priest calibrator, 3rd rank. Skills, status reading, ritual of purification, and prayer of order. Code, clean, stable. This man believed what he was saying. He truly believed it. He wasn't lying to the crowd. He was conveying what he had been taught, and what he had been taught was a lie. Not a malicious lie, a lie born of ignorance. The church didn't know how the system worked. They could read the surface, the color of the window, the status text, but they didn't see the code, didn't understand the architecture, didn't know that the system was a program, not a deity. And so they treated with prayer what needed to be treated with debugging. Dan left the square. He found a bulletin board at City Hall. Jobs. The city was looking for workers. Porters at the port, cleaners in the barracks, laborers on construction sites. Work for the classless. Hard, dirty, low-paying, but legal. He took the job as a dock worker. Celeste found a position at the city library, a transcriber, a theoretical mage with neat handwriting and knowledge of 6 languages. The librarian didn't ask about her status. He asked how many pages a day she could transcribe. Thomas stayed in the room. It was too early for a 10-year-old boy to be working, even by this world's standards. Dan gave him a task: to listen, to walk around the city, to memorize conversations. The boy, with his scout class, was made for this, literally. His skills included keen hearing, a photographic memory, and the ability to remain unnoticed. Dan had fixed all that for him a week ago. It was time to put it to use. They had been living in Thornwood for 10 days. Dan hauled crates at the port during the day. At night, he studied the city's code. Thornwood was bigger than Vesper and Crowhall combined. Thousands of people, thousands of statuses, dozens of regional subsystems, and they had bugs, lots of bugs. Not like the ones in the villages. City bugs were more complex. Skills that conflicted with each other, classes with outdated dependencies, parameters that were calculated incorrectly due to rounding errors, trivial things, but trivial things that ruined people's lives. A blacksmith whose hardening skill worked only half the time, parameters calculated incorrectly due to rounding errors. Little things, but little things that ruined people's lives. A blacksmith whose hardening skill worked only half the time. A healer whose potions were weaker than they should be. A merchant whose class wouldn't let him trade certain goods because of a bug in the permissions list. Dan saw all of this, and his hands itched to fix it, but he held back. Every fix is a diff. Every diff is a trace, and the readers were hot on their heels. Celeste checked every evening. Movement in the south had slowed. His camouflage at the hub had worked. The readers had lost their bearings. They were circling the Crowhall area, looking for a trail, but they couldn't find it. Not yet, anyway. On the 11th day, Thomas ran into the room with news. He had overheard a conversation at the market. 2 merchants from the eastern province were discussing a girl, a princess, the heir to the Calder royal house. Her name was Irene, and she had run away. Irene Calder was born with a cursed status. Her window was neither red nor green. It was black, the decay root class, the only one in the world. The church declared her the living embodiment of heresy. Her own family locked her in a tower when she was 3 years old. For 16 years she lived within 4 walls. She was told that her existence was killing the world, that every breath she took was destroying the system, that she should be grateful they hadn't burned her at the stake. 3 days ago she escaped. How exactly, no one knew. The tower was protected by a triple perimeter of the system, but she was gone. And now the church, the crown, and half the mercenaries on the continent were searching for her. The reward for her capture was equal to the annual budget of a medium-sized city. Dan listened and thought. The root of decay, the black window, the only class in the world. It didn't sound like a curse. It sounded like a unique system class. Diagnostic, utility, something the system had created not for humans, but for itself. And somehow it had ended up in a living child. He wanted to see that code. He wanted it very much. But the princess was somewhere far away, and he had other problems. He was running out of money. The readies were circling. And every day in the city he saw people with bugs in their statuses and couldn't do anything about it, because every edit could be his last. On the 12th day, everything changed. He was walking down an alley near the port at night. He was coming back from a late shift, tired, not looking around, and he heard a sound, quiet, like a moan, from a dead end between the warehouses. He stopped. He peeked inside. A girl was lying on the ground in the dead end, in torn travel clothes, with a hood pulled over her face, skinny, beaten up, unconscious. and a status window hung above her, black. Dan stood in the alley and looked at the black window. He had seen black windows in descriptions, heard about them in conversations, but he had never stood in front of one, and now he was standing there, and his hands were shaking, not from fear, from professional excitement, because the code of this window was the most complex and the most beautiful code he had ever seen in his entire life, both lives. He knelt down next to the girl. She was breathing, weakly, irregularly, bruises on her face, scrapes on her arms. Her clothes were torn. Someone had beaten her, or she had fallen, or both. He carefully lifted the hood. A young face, pale, dark hair, sharp features. Even in unconsciousness, there was a hardness to them, learned, imprinted over the years. The face of a person who was used to enduring. Dan touched her wrist. Her pulse was weak but steady. She would live. Then he looked at the code. The decay root class. He expanded it, and froze. It wasn't a class, not in the usual sense. A typical class is a set of skills, parameters, and limitations packaged into a single module. Warrior, mage, artisan. Simple constructs, understandable, predictable. What hung over Irene Calder was something entirely different. It was a diagnostic module, a system utility, not intended for humans at all. It was created for monitoring, for tracking malfunctions, for detecting errors in other classes. The root of decay did not destroy the world, it diagnosed it. Irene was not the cause of the heresy. She was a detector, a living scanner. Her class was supposed to find malfunctions in the system, show where and what was broken, sound the alarm. But someone, a long time ago, corrupted the module's signature, a single line in the header. Where it should have said System Diagnostician, it read Root of Decay. An error in the name, a typo, maybe intentional, maybe accidental. And because of that one line, the world had considered her a monster for 19 years. Dan sat in a dirty alley next to the battered princess and looked at the typo that had stolen her life. And in his head, he heard the voice of his former team lead from a past life, who used to say that variable naming is the most important thing in programming, because a bad name kills more projects than bad code. A bad name kills, literally. He didn't fix anything, not here, not in the alley, not now. The girl was unconscious, and he didn't know what fixing it might trigger. The diagnostic module could react unpredictably, and a change of that magnitude would leave a diff that the readers would sense across half the continent. He picked her up. She was light, too light for her height. 6 years in the tower hadn't encouraged a healthy diet. He carried her through the dark streets of Thornwood. He tried not to be seen. A classless guy carrying a girl in his arms in the middle of the night. Not the best sight. Celeste hadn't been sleeping. She opened the door and saw Dan with the body in his arms and didn't ask a single question. She just stepped back, helped lay the girl on the bed. Then she saw the black window and turned pale. She knew. All mage theorists knew about the root of decay, the most dangerous class in the world, a living curse, a walking disaster. Celeste took a step back. Dan said 2 words to her. She's not dangerous. Then he explained. He told her what he'd seen in the code, the diagnostic module, a corrupted signature, a typo in the name. Celeste listened. Her face changed. The fear faded. Understanding came. Then came anger. Quiet. Cold. The anger of a scientist who understands the scale of another's mistake. 19 years in the tower because of a typo. Celeste said that if this was true, then the Church's entire doctrine on the heresy of decay was built on a fundamental misunderstanding. They aren't just unable to heal. They've locked away the only tool that could show them exactly what's broken. Dan nodded. It was like discovering that someone had locked the system administrator in the basement and declared him a virus. Irene woke up at dawn. She opened her eyes. She saw an unfamiliar ceiling, unfamiliar faces. She flinched. She tried to stand up. She couldn't. Her body wouldn't obey her. Dan was sitting against the wall. He didn't move. He didn't approach. He knew that a girl who had lived in confinement for 16 years wouldn't be happy to have strangers' hands near her. Celeste stood by the door. Thomas slept in the corner. Irene looked around. She pressed her back against the wall. Her face was stony, her eyes appraising. She asked who they were. Her voice was even, emotionless, rehearsed. The voice of a person who had learned not to show weakness. Dan told the truth. He said he was a classless man from a village on the edge of the kingdom, that he'd found her unconscious in an alley, that he'd brought her here, and that he knew what she was. Irene tensed. He knew what she was. Everyone knew what she was. The root of decay, a curse, a monster. Dan said no. He said her class wasn't a curse, that he could see it from the inside, that it was a diagnostic tool, that she didn't destroy the world, that she was born to feel it. Irene looked at him, silently, for a long time. Then she said he was lying. Then she said everyone was lying. Then she turned away toward the wall. Dan didn't argue. He knew words wouldn't help. For 19 years, she'd been told one thing. One stranger wasn't going to undo that in a morning. It would take time, and proof. He asked Celeste if they could postpone fixing the signature until Irene was ready. Celeste said they could. The module worked even with a corrupted signature. It just didn't work right. Instead of an accurate diagnosis, it gave out chaotic signals. Irene sensed the system's glitches, but didn't understand what she was feeling, like a person with perfect pitch but a broken ear. There are sounds, no melody. For 3 days, Irene didn't leave her room. She didn't speak. She ate little. She sat by the wall and stared at a single point. Thomas brought her food. The boy wasn't afraid of the black window. He'd seen Dan fix people. He'd seen the windows change. For him, the color of one's status was no longer a sentence. It was simply a condition, one that could be changed. On the 4th day, Irene spoke, not to Dan, to Thomas. She asked why he wasn't afraid of her. The boy shrugged. He said that Dan had fixed his whole village. He said that if anyone could fix her, it was him. Irene looked at Dan across the room, for the first time, without hostility, with a question. Dan was sitting on the floor, reading the wall's code, not because he was interested, but because he'd learned not to pressure people who weren't ready, in both lives. Irene asked what fix meant. Dan answered simply. He said there was an error in her status, one line, the wrong name. If it were corrected, her class would function as intended. She would sense the system's glitches, precisely, directly, like a tool, not like a curse. Irene was silent. Then she asked what if he was wrong? What if she really was the root of decay? What if the fix unleashed what she was holding inside? Dan looked her in the eyes. He said he wasn't wrong, that he could see her code, all of it, from the first line to the last, and that there was nothing destructive in it, only diagnostics, only monitoring, only care for a world that doesn't know it's sick. Irene turned away, but something flickered in her eyes, a crack in the wall she had been building for 19 years. On the 5th day of Irene's stay in their room, everything went off course. In the morning, Dan left for his shift at the port. He returned around noon and saw Thomas standing at the door, his face pale. The boy said one word, guards. Dan entered the room. Celeste was sitting at the table, calmly rewriting her manuscript. Irene was lying on the bed, covered with a blanket up to her chin. The black window was hidden. Dan asked what had happened. Celeste said that a city guard had come by half an hour ago. A guest check, the usual, routine. Thornwood did this once every 2 weeks. The guard checked their statuses. Dan, a classless. Celeste, a theorist. Thomas, as a scout. He wrote it down and left. He didn't see Irene. Celeste had managed to cover her with a blanket and distract the guard with a conversation about the library's collections. But that was luck, not a plan. Next time, they might not be so lucky. They needed to move, get out of Thornwood, or hide Irene better, or solve the problem of her status. Dan sat on the floor and thought. The problem was complex. Irene called her, wanted by the crown and the church, a reward for her capture, a black mark impossible to miss, and 3 readers somewhere in the south who would sooner or later pick up his trail. Celeste said the readers were delayed. Her sense told her they were still in the Crow Hall area. The cover at the hub was working, but not forever. Sooner or later they'd figure it out. Dan made a decision. It was time to fix Irene. Not because she was ready. She wasn't ready. But because the black window was a beacon. Every theoretical mage within a 5-league radius could sense it. Every priest could see it. Every guard could spot it. If he fixed the signature, the black color would disappear. The module would start working properly. The window would change. And Irene would stop being a walking target. He walked over to her, sat down beside her. She opened her eyes, looked at him warily. He said the signature needed to be fixed, now. Explained why. He didn't pressure her. He didn't try to persuade her. He simply stated the facts. The black window is visible. They're looking for them. If it isn't fixed, they'll find her, and they'll find him, and Celeste, and Thomas. Irene was silent. Then she asked what would happen if he fixed it. Dan said he didn't know for sure. He said the module would start working as a diagnostic tool. She would sense system glitches, clearly, directly, with an understanding of what it was and where it was, instead of the chaotic noise she'd felt her whole life. Irene closed her eyes. Chaotic noise. So that's what it's called. She knew that noise, her whole life, a constant hum at the edge of her consciousness, flashes of pain when someone nearby lost their class, a feeling of decay when the system malfunctioned. She thought it was her curse that was destroying the world around her, that she was the source. And now this stranger with an empty status was telling her that she wasn't the source, that she was a receiver, that she wasn't breaking the world, that she could hear it breaking. She opened her eyes, said, "Do it." Dan placed his hand on her wrist. He closed his eyes. The module's code unfolded before him, vast, complex, beautiful. Thousands of lines of diagnostic procedures, thousands of monitoring functions. It was a masterpiece of engineering. Whoever had written the system, they had created this module with particular care. The way one creates a mission-critical system, an early warning system, a fire alarm. Dan found the signature line, the root of decay. He deleted it. He typed in what was supposed to be there. System diagnostician. 2 seconds. 1 edit. Minimal diff. But the world shook. Irene flinched. She opened her eyes wide. The black window above her flickered, went dark, and flashed. Not green, not red, white. A bright white light flooded the room. Celeste shielded her eyes with her hand. Thomas recoiled. Dan didn't move. He was staring at the code. The module was rebooting, like a system after an update. All diagnostic procedures activated one after another. Monitoring turned on, calibrated, scanned. The window glowed white for 3 seconds. Then it settled. It turned a soft silver, calm, stable. Class, system diagnostician. Rank, undefined. Skills. The list began to unfold. Fault detection, flow analysis, damage mapping, prediction of cascading failures, identification of external interference. Dozens of skills, all diagnostic, all powerful. Not a single combat skill. A pure tool. Pure concern for the world. Irene sat on the bed and looked at her window. Silver. For the first time in her life, not black. For the first time in her life, not cursed. She read the skills, one by one. Her lips moved silently. Then she raised her hand, slowly, and touched the window, just as Dan had touched his that night on the barn roof. Her fingers traced the surface. The window responded, with a soft pulsation, like a greeting. She began to cry, quietly, soundlessly. Tears streamed down her cheeks, and she didn't wipe them away. She wasn't crying from pain, not from joy, from relief. 19 years of heaviness that had suddenly vanished. Dan stood up, stepped back, gave her space. Celeste stood by the window and cried too, because she felt it, the correction, the module's reboot, the wave of diagnostic signals that went out from Irene in all directions. It was beautiful, incredibly beautiful, like turning on a lighthouse that had been silent for 19 years. Then Celeste turned pale, suddenly. She grabbed the windowsill. Dan turned around. "What?" Celeste said quietly. "Diff." The signature edit was small, but the module reboot. The reboot was loud, very loud. Upon powering up, the module scanned the entire region. It sent diagnostic requests in all directions. It was like turning on a spotlight in a dark room. Everyone who could sense the flows, all the theoretical mages, all the readers, every single one of them, for hundreds of leagues around, had just sensed that in Thornwood, something impossible had happened. Dan closed his eyes. He cursed in a language that didn't exist in this world. They had to leave. Now. Immediately. They were ready in 10 minutes. Dan, Celeste, Irene, Thomas, the 4 of them, on foot, without horses, without money, with 3 readers to the south and an unknown number of theoretical mages all around who had just turned their gaze toward Thornwood. They left through the north gate in the pre-dawn darkness. Irene walked on her own, staggering, but on her own, with a silvery window above her head, with a new name in her status, System Diagnostician. She walked, her eyes wide open. Because for the first time in her life, the noise in her head had become clear. It had become understandable. She could feel the system all around her, every glitch, every crack, every bug, not as pain, as information. And she sensed something to the south, far away, huge, rotting, spreading, the heresy of decay. She sensed its epicenter, the direction, the distance, the source. She stopped, turned to Dan. She said she knew where the decay was coming from, that she could sense it, that she could show the way. Dan looked at her, at the silvery window, at the eyes in which, for the first time, it wasn't pain but purpose that burned. And he thought, 15 minutes ago, he had just wanted to run away, to hide, to wait it out. But now he had a compass, a living compass pointing to the source of the catastrophe that was devouring the world. They headed northwest, away from the roads, away from the cities, through fields and woodlands. Irene pointed the way, not roughly, precisely, like a compass needle. She could sense the epicenter of the collapse constantly, a rumbling to the southeast, huge, pulsating, far away but distinct, like hearing a fire on the horizon. But they weren't heading toward the epicenter. They were running from their pursuers. The epicenter could wait. First, they had to survive. They walked in silence for the first 2 days. Irene didn't speak. She was getting used to it, to the sky above her head, to the wind, to the ground beneath her feet, to the fact that you can go wherever you want and no one will stop you. 16 years in the tower. The longest distance she'd ever walked in a day was 12 steps from the bed to the window. Now she walked for hours, and her legs ached, and her back ached, and everything ached. But she walked, and she didn't complain, because the pain in her legs was freedom. Celeste walked beside Irene and asked questions quietly, gently, the way you ask a bird that has just learned to fly. What do you feel? How far can you feel? Can you tell one type of glitch from another? Irene answered briefly, yes, no, I don't know. Far, close, painful, not painful. She was learning a new language, the language of her own gift, that gift which for 19 years had been wrapped in the black wrapping of a curse. Dan walked behind them, listening to their conversation and thinking about something else, about scale. He had repaired one village, 56 people. It took 6 days of non-stop work. There were thousands of such villages throughout Arkadion, tens of thousands of people with disabled classes. He was alone, 2 hands, 1 skill. If he repaired one village a week, it would take him years, decades, a century. And in that time, the collapse would destroy even more. He couldn't repair the world piece by piece. He needed a different approach, a scalable one. On the 3rd day of their journey, they came across a road, not a big one, a country lane. A girl was walking along the road, alone, on foot, in tattered clothes, with a sword at her belt. Dan saw her status and stopped. A red window, critical error, class not defined. But the code said otherwise. She had a class, swordsman, master rank. The entire skill set was intact, every single one. Blade mastery, shield mastery, tactical vision, accelerated reaction. Everything was recorded, everything was intact. But on top of all that lay a foreign diff, like a seal, like a stamp. Someone had come from outside and overwritten the activity flag, just like in Vesper, just like in Crow Hall. But here was the difference. The diff was fresh, 3 or 4 days old, and it was signed, not with a name, with a number. The tag read, Purge, Node 52, Cycle 3. Same format as in Crow Hall, but a different node, a different region. The second editor was still working, right now, somewhere, methodically shutting people down. The girl was walking down the road and didn't see them. Dan stepped out of the bushes. She spun around instantly, hand on her sword, combat stance, perfect. Her body remembered, her muscles remembered, her reflexes remembered. The class didn't work, but the person remained. Dan raised his hands, empty. He said he wasn't an enemy. He said he could see her window. He said he could help. The girl looked at him, eyes red, face hard. Her voice broke when she told him to get lost, that she didn't need pity, that she could handle it. Her name was Hana Ryu, 21 years old, formerly the best swordswoman in the Royal Guard. 3 months ago, she woke up and the class was empty, without warning, for no reason. She had been a swordswoman. Now she was nothing. She was kicked out of the guard that very day. No severance pay, no pension, no explanation. Because a classless person has no right to wear a uniform. For 3 months, she walked, on foot, across half the continent, without a goal, without a plan, with a sword that no longer obeyed the system. She could hold it, she could swing it, but her skills wouldn't activate. A master's strike without system amplification is a novice's strike. She knew that, and yet she wouldn't let go of the sword, because the sword was the only thing she had left. Dan stepped closer. She didn't back down. She glared, defiantly, like a person ready to fight not because they can win, but because they don't know how to give up. He said her class was intact, that everything was intact, that someone had simply turned it off, and that he could turn it back on. Hana was silent. Then she asked who he was. Dan told the truth. Classless, from the village, who knows how to fix statuses. Hana looked at him as if he were crazy. Statuses can't be fixed. Everyone knew that. That what the system gave, the system takes away. A person can't. Dan held out his hand. She looked at his hand, then at his face, then at Celeste and Irene and Thomas standing at the edge of the road. 4 strangers, 1 classless, 1 mag theorist, 1 girl with a silver window Hana had never seen before, and a boy. Hana reached out her hand. Dan took her by the wrist. He unlocked the code, found a foreign diff, the second editor's diff, a purge tag, Node 52, Cycle 3. He didn't just reset the flag. He removed the foreign tag, carefully, like peeling off a band-aid, because he wanted to preserve it, as evidence, as a sample of the second editor's handwriting. Then he restored the activity flag, turned it on. The window flashed, the red color faded, green flashed. Class, swordsman, rank, master, skills, all of them, every single one. Hana Ryu stood on the dusty road and looked at the green window. Then she drew her sword, not to attack. She assumed a stance, the third stance of the Iron Wind School, the master's basic position. The system responded, the skill activated, her body remembered. No, her body hadn't forgotten. Her body had always remembered. Now the system confirmed what her body already knew. Hana made a single strike, a test strike. The air whistled. The blade sliced through space with that sound that only happens when system enhancement, muscle memory, and mastery come together as one. She froze at the finish of the strike. She stood motionless. A second, 2, 3. Then she lowered her sword. She turned to Dan. Her face was wet. Her eyes were red, but not from pain, from rage. She said someone had stolen 3 months from her. 3 months of shame and hunger and aimless wandering. 3 months when she thought it was all over. And all that time, her class had been right there, just turned off, like the light in a room. Dan nodded. He said she wasn't the only one, that this is happening all over Arkadion, that someone is deliberately turning people off. Hana gripped the hilt of her sword. She asked who. Dan said he didn't know yet, but he was going to find out. Hana looked at him, at the classless guy with an empty status, at the theoretical mage, at the girl with the silver window, at the boy, at the group of people walking down the country road away from everything, and she said she was going with them. Dan didn't object. They needed someone with a sword. Because he was fixing people. He didn't fight. But the world around them was growing ever more dangerous. There were 5 of them now. A classless engineer, a theoretical mage, a system diagnostician, a warrior swordswoman, and a 10-year-old scout. 5 people on a muddy road, each broken in their own way, each repaired in their own way, and each on a path toward something none of them could yet name. They walked for 4 days to the northwest, without a road, through hills covered in tough brush. Hana walked ahead, with a sword, with her class restored, with a fury she didn't yet know where to direct. She scouted the path, checked the ravines. She listened to the forest. 3 months without her class hadn't erased her instincts. A warrior's body never forgets. Thomas walked beside her, a Boy Scout and a master swordswoman, a strange pair, but they clicked instantly. Thomas saw and heard what Hana missed. Hana reacted to what Thomas couldn't process. Dan walked in the middle, Celeste on the right, Irene on the left. Irene walked in silence. She listened to the world. Her new gift worked continuously, like radar. She sensed every glitch within a radius of dozens of leagues, minor cracks in the system, faded skills, reset classes. The world around them was full of malfunctions, and with each passing day, she learned to distinguish them more precisely. On the 2nd day of their journey, she stopped and said there was a village ahead, 8 leagues to the northwest, 23 active statuses, 7 scarlet ones. Dan asked, 7 out of 23? Irene nodded. Almost a third of the village. Burned out classes, the same pattern, the same decay. They hadn't planned to stop, but 7 people, a third of the village. Dan looked at Celeste. She shook her head. She said the readers lost track of him after he cloaked at the node, but they definitely felt the surge from Irene's reboot. They know the general region. They're searching. Every new edit is a risk. Dan nodded. He looked at Irene. She stood there, staring toward the invisible village. Her face was stony, but her hands were clenched into fists. She could sense those 7, not as numbers, as pain, as a fading light. Dan said they'd go in. Celeste sighed. She didn't argue. She already knew it was useless to argue with him. He couldn't just walk past. The village was called Graven. 23 households, a mill, a smithy, a small temple of the calibration church. The priest had left 2 months ago and hadn't returned. 7 people with scarlet windows. The same pattern. Flags turned off. Purification marks. Node 49. Cycle 3. Another node. The same cycle. Cycle 3. Dan remembered this. In Crowhall it was Cycle 3. There was Cycle 3 at Hana's marker. Here it's Cycle 3. This isn't a coincidence. It's an iteration. The 3rd pass. The 2nd editor worked in cycles, going through the regions again and again, like a script that runs on a schedule. 1st cycle, 2nd cycle, 3rd cycle, deeper with each cycle, more people with each pass. Dan fixed 7 in 2 days, faster than in Crowhall. He was gaining experience, learning to find broken flags faster, learning to restore connections more efficiently. His hands remembered the pattern. His brain remembered the structure. Like a mechanic who takes apart the same engine over and over, faster each time, more precise each time. But he didn't need speed in his hands. He needed scale. 7 people in 2 days. That's fast for manual labor, and insignificant for a continent. In Graven, he found something new. One of the broken ones was a girl, 17 years old, quiet, invisible. She sat in the corner of the house and never went outside. Her name was Mei So-yeon, and she had no class. Not burned out, not turned off, not broken. Empty, just like Dan's. A blank disk with nothing recorded on it. Critical error, class undefined, entity non-viable. Dan stood in front of her and looked at the crimson window, his own reflection. 19 years of this. He knew every second, every glance that passed him by, every word that went over his head. Every day when you wake up and the world reminds you that you're a mistake. Mei looked up at him, big dark eyes, alert, accustomed to people looking away. Dan sat down next to her, on the floor, to be at the same level. He opened her code, an empty class field, just like his, exactly like his, a blank slate, unfilled, but not broken. The system hadn't recorded a class at birth. The transaction had been interrupted. He could have assigned her any class, any of the thousands that existed. Warrior, mage, artisan, healer, anything. He could have given her what she'd been waiting for 17 years. He didn't. Because that would have been making the decision for her. It would have been rewriting a person, exactly what he feared most. Who was he to decide who she should be? Instead, he did something else. He showed her her window. Not the code. She wouldn't have understood the code. He showed her an empty field, explained what it meant, told her she wasn't broken, that her field was empty because no one had written a class there, and that it wasn't a curse, it was an opportunity, a one-of-a-kind opportunity. Everyone is born with a class. The system decides for them. Blacksmith, warrior, mage, weaver. You don't choose, it's assigned to you. But Mei has a blank field, a clean slate. She's the only one in the world who can choose for herself. Mei listened, her eyes wide open. She didn't understand half of what he said, but she understood the main point, that he didn't see her as a mistake, that he saw her as an opportunity. No one in her life had ever looked at her that way. She asked if she could go with them. Dan looked at the group. Hana stood by the door, sharpening her sword. Celeste sat at the table writing formulas. Irene stood by the window, listening to the world. Thomas slept in the corner. 4, now 5, and soon 6. He said yes. Mei packed her things in 5 minutes, because she had almost nothing. They left Graven at dawn, 6 of them. At the village exit, Dan stopped. He turned to Celeste. He asked if she could sense the readers. Celeste closed her eyes. She listened, for a long time. Then she opened her eyes and said yes, closer, much closer than before. They weren't heading south. They were to the east, and moving fast, on horseback. Maybe 2 days' journey, maybe 3. They'd found a trail, not a diff from Crowhall, a surge from Irene's reboot in Thornwood. They were heading toward that surge. And now they were close. Dan looked north, west, east, run further, hide, or what? Hana approached. She said she was ready to fight, that 3 readers weren't an army, that she was a master swordswoman and could hold them off. Dan shook his head. Readers aren't soldiers, they're inquisitors, trained, with systemic skills honed for hunting heretics. 1 swordswoman against 3 is suicide. Celeste said there was another option. They could head for the city of Olmar, the regional capital, a big city, tens of thousands of people, thousands of statuses, a sea of noise in which one could drown, like at that junction in the forest. But on a larger scale, Dan thought. There's a crowd in the city. You can hide in a crowd. But in Olmar there's a church temple, the Calibration Cathedral, the Inquisition. The readers are based right there, to go straight into their nest. Celeste said that's exactly why it would work. The readers had left Olmar and headed east. They're searching here, in the fields, in the villages. They don't expect the target to come to their home. Dan looked at her. She was smiling, subtly. For the first time in days, she wasn't just smart. She thought like a strategist. They turned southeast, toward Olmar. They walked quickly. Hana set the pace. The warrior swordswoman with system-enhanced stamina walked like a machine. The others trailed behind. Irene could barely keep up. 16 years in the tower don't go by without leaving a mark. But she didn't complain. She gritted her teeth and kept going. May walked beside her, quietly. She offered her shoulder when Irene staggered, without asking, without imposing herself. She was simply there. 2 days' journey, Olmar appeared on the horizon in the evening of the second day. A big city, walls, towers, spires of temples, the Calibration Cathedral in the center, a golden dome, visible from 10 leagues away. Dan looked at the city and felt the same tremor he'd felt on the roof of the barn on the night of his coming of age. Not fear, a premonition. He was walking into the lair of the church that had been burning people like him for 1,000 years, with 5 people behind him. No plan, one skill, and the realization that there was nowhere left to run. They entered Olmar through the western gate, amid a stream of merchants and farmers and mercenaries, 6 among hundreds. No one took notice. The city was enormous. After Vesper and Crowhall and Thornwood, Olmar seemed like another world. Stone houses 3 or 4 stories high, paved streets, lanterns at the intersections, shops and taverns and workshops, and people, thousands of people, with green and yellow and scarlet windows. Dan walked down the street and saw the city's code, thousands of files, tens of thousands of lines. Streams of data flowed like rivers. Regional nodes stood at every intersection, disguised as lampposts and cornerstones and fountains. The city was so thoroughly permeated by the system that the code was everywhere, in the walls, in the cobblestones of the pavement, in the very air. And at the center of it all stood the Calibration Cathedral, a golden dome. Dan could sense it without even looking. The hub, huge, central, the calibration altar, the system's main nerve center for the entire region. All the data flows pass through it, all the updates, all the statuses, all the changes. It hummed like a server under full load, constantly, powerfully, deafening. Celeste was right. In all that noise, their diffs were invisible, like a whisper in a stadium. They rented 2 rooms in a cheap tavern on the outskirts of the commercial district. Dan paid with the last money he'd earned as a porter in Thornwood. For 3 nights. After that, they'd have to figure it out. Hana went out to look for work. A swordswoman with a master class and experience in the Royal Guard would find a job in an hour. And that's exactly what happened. By evening, she returned with a contract. Security at a warehouse in the port, night shift, good pay, no questions asked about her past. Thomas went out again to listen to the city. May went with him. 2 silent observers, a scout and a ghost. Without a class, May was invisible in the crowd. People didn't notice the classless. It had been a curse, and now it had become a weapon. Celeste went to the city library, a massive one, thousands of volumes, archives, chronicles, academic works. She was looking for information on the heresy of decay, a chronology, maps, patterns, anything that could confirm or refute the hypothesis about the second editor. Irene stayed in the room. She couldn't go out. The silver window drew attention. No one else in the world had a window that color. But she wasn't sitting idle. She sat on the bed with her eyes closed and listened to the city. Every glitch, every crack, every bug and every status within a mile. And she drew a map, in her head, a map of Olmar's breakdowns. Dan stayed with her. He sat on the floor and thought, about scale, about strategy, about what to do next. He couldn't fix the world by hand. Too slow, too loud, too dangerous. He needed another way. And the answer stood in the center of the city, the golden dome, the calibration altar, the central node. If he could mask the diffs on a small forest node by overloading the queue with noise, what could he do at the central node of an entire region? Theoretically, he could roll out a fix for the entire region at once through the altar. One commit, hundreds of fixes, thousands of people, a mass hotfix. It was madness. The altar stood in the cathedral. The cathedral was the church's fortress, guards, priests, analysts, and if the readers returned from the chase, they would be there. But the idea wouldn't let go. Thomas returned in the evening, with news, bad news. A platform had been set up in the square by the cathedral. Tomorrow morning, the church was holding a public trial, a show trial to erase a class, an execution of the soul. The accused was an orphaned boy, 12 years old, healer class, first rank. He was accused of heresy. He treated people without a license from the church, without a priest's approval, on his own, with his own class, with his own hands, in a poor neighborhood where there wasn't a single licensed healer. He treated people because he could, and for that, they decided to erase him, in front of the whole city, so that others would see, so others would know. The system belongs to the church, not to you. Dan listened to Thomas. His face remained unchanged, his hands clenched. 12 years old, a boy. He healed people, and for that, they would publicly erase him. They wouldn't kill him physically. Worse, class erasure is the deletion of everything: skills, abilities, connections, potential. The person remains alive, but ceases to be anyone, becomes an empty shell. Dan knew what that looked like in code. Complete deletion. Not just unchecking a flag. File deletion. After that, there's nothing to restore, nothing to fix. Irreversible. Celeste returned from the library by nightfall, with dark circles under her eyes and a stack of printouts. She'd found something. A chronology of the heresy of decay over the past 10 years. A map of the outbreaks, regions, dates, number of victims. She spread the clippings out on the floor, and Dan saw a pattern. The outbreaks came in waves, in cycles. The first cycle 7 years ago, dozens of cases, scattered, across the continent. The second cycle 4 years ago, hundreds of cases, entire villages. The third cycle began a year ago, thousands, cities, regions. With each cycle, the scale grew. With each cycle, more people. With each cycle, deeper damage. Cycle 3. The markers in the code said the same thing, the third pass. Dan looked at the map and didn't see outbreaks of disease. He saw a plan, a schedule, a methodical dismantling. Someone was taking the world apart piece by piece, layer by layer, cycle by cycle. And in a year or two, the fourth cycle would begin. And then it wouldn't be villages that would crumble. Cities, kingdoms, the very fabric of reality. He looked at his watch. 6 hours until dawn. 8 until the boy's execution in the square. He had 8 hours to make a decision. Go to the square and save the child in front of the whole city and the church. Or sit in the tavern and wait and plan and be smart and cautious and rational. He looked at Celeste. She shook her head. Not now. Too dangerous. Too soon. They aren't ready. He looked at Hana. She had her hand on her sword. Ready. He looked at Irene. She was sitting with her eyes closed. Then she opened them. She said quietly, "The boy is in the square." She can sense him. A healer's class. Small, pure, bright. Tomorrow they'll wipe him out. And she'll feel it too. How it fades. How it disappears. And she doesn't want to feel it. Dan closed his eyes. Opened them. Stood up. He said he was going to the square. Alone. Celeste said he was an idiot. Hana said she was going with him. Irene stood up and said she was going too. May silently pulled on her raincoat. Thomas was already standing by the door. Dan looked at them. 5 of them. Everyone. No one was left. He couldn't find the words. He just nodded. The morning was gray. The clouds hung low. The square in front of the Calibration Cathedral was filling with people. Hundreds of townspeople. Merchants were closing their stalls and coming to watch. Children sat on their fathers' shoulders. Guards stood along the perimeter. 20 men in uniform with systemic skills of order. 3 stood on the platform. A calibrator priest in white robes. A flow analyst in gray. And him, a boy. 12 years old, skinny, barefoot, hands tied behind his back, a green window above his head, still green for now. Class, healer, first rank. Skills, basic diagnostics, wound healing, and pain relief. A small set, clean, honest. The set of a boy who healed people because he could. Dan stood in the crowd, hood up, Celeste to his right, Hana to his left, Irene and May and Thomas behind him, 6 in a crowd of 500. The priest began to speak, loudly, in a measured voice. He said that the system was sacred, that the right to use its gifts was determined by the church, that the boy had broken the law by practicing without a license, that he would be stripped of his class by decision of the calibration council, in the name of order, in the name of the architect. The crowd was silent, not because they agreed, because they were afraid. Dan looked at the boy, at his code, clean, not a single bug, not a single error, not a single broken flag. A healthy, living class that needed no fixing, that they were simply going to kill. The priest raised the ritual staff. The staff was connected to the altar. Through it, the church performed system operations, initiations, calibrations, and erasures. The priest brought the staff to the boy's window. The boy closed his eyes. He didn't cry. He stood straight, 12 years old and standing straight. Dan moved. Hana placed a hand on his shoulder, not to stop him, to let him know she was there. He walked through the crowd. People parted. A classless boy in a dirty cloak. No one paid him any mind. Classless people go unnoticed. He climbed onto the platform. 3 steps. The priest turned. The analyst turned. The guard turned. The boy opened his eyes. Dan placed his hand on the child's window. The priest screamed. The guard moved. The flow analyst flinched because he felt a touch on the system. But it was too late. Dan was already in the code. The priest's staff had triggered the erasure procedure. Dan saw it, how the deletion mechanism spun into motion, how the system began to wipe line by line. Skills, parameters, connections, class, everything, sequentially, mercilessly. He didn't stop the procedure, he rolled it back. Just like rolling back a transaction in a database. Rollback. Every deleted line was restored. Every reset parameter was restored. The erasure procedure pressed on. Dan followed it and undid every step, in real time. The guards grabbed him by the shoulders, 2 of them, pulling him back. He didn't move, hand on the window, eyes closed, total concentration. He saw only code. The erasure continued, and the rollback continued, line by line, skill by skill. The priest struck his arm with a staff. Dan felt nothing. Hana appeared on the platform, sword in hand. She did not attack. She stood between Dan and the guards, a defensive stance. 20 guards against a single swordswoman. But the swordswoman was a master, and her stance was a promise. The first one to touch him would lose a hand. The erasure procedure was over. The rod shut off. The priest waited for the boy's window to go dark, to turn gray, empty, dead. The window flickered and flashed green. Healer class, first rank, skills, all in place, every single one. The crowd froze. 500 people. Silence. The priest looked at the window, at the green window that was supposed to go dark, and didn't. The boy opened his eyes, looked at his window, looked at Dan. Dan took his hand away, turned to the crowd. 500 faces, 500 pairs of eyes. And he saw in those eyes what he hadn't expected. Not fear, not anger. Hope. He saw people with crimson windows, dozens of them. Standing in the crowd were dozens of people with zeroed-out classes, the very victims of the collapse, those whom the church had declared cursed, those whom they pitied and isolated and forgot. And they looked at the boy's green window and saw the impossible, an erasure that hadn't worked, a fate that had returned. And then Dan did what he hadn't planned, what changed everything. He jumped off the platform. He walked up to the nearest person with a crimson window, a woman, around 40. A former cook, class reset 2 months ago. He touched her hand, unlocked the code, same pattern, flag at 0, activated. The woman's window flashed, scarlet turned to green. Cook, second rank. The woman gasped. Next, a man, former carpenter, scarlet window, same flag, activated, green. Next, a girl, 14 years old, former herbalist, activated, green. He walked through the crowd, touched hands, activated, green, green, green. One after another, the red windows went dark, the green ones flashed. The crowd parted before him. People were crying. People were laughing. People stood motionless, staring at their windows, unable to believe it. The priest shouted from the platform, "Heresy! Heresy! Stop the heretic!" The guards did not move. 20 guards stood and watched as a man in a dirty cloak walked across the square and restored people's destinies. And they couldn't move, because some of them, too, had scarlet windows. Dan reached the edge of the square. 37 people, 37 edits, 37 diffs. In 10 minutes, his hands were shaking. His head was splitting. Every edit drained his strength. Not physical, mental, concentration, focus, precision. 37 edits in a row without stopping. It was like writing 37 hotfixes in production in 10 minutes. No review, no tests, pure craftsmanship. Celeste took him by the arm. He staggered. The world was spinning, but he stood, and the square roared. Not with screams, with a rumble. The rumble of 500 voices that didn't know what to say, that had seen the impossible and couldn't name it. Hana stood nearby, sword sheathed. The guards didn't attack. The priest fell silent. The flow analyst sat on the platform and wept, because he felt it. All 37 edits, every single one, pure, precise, impossible. And at that moment, the cathedral doors opened, and a man stepped out onto the square, tall, thin, in a black robe with a silver emblem on his chest. He of the inner circle, a reader, but not one of the three Celeste had sensed in the East. Another, older, higher in rank, eyes cold, calm. The eyes of a man who had seen much and whom little surprised. He looked at Dan across the square, through the crowd, through the 37 fresh diffs that blazed like a bonfire in the night. Supreme Reader Anselm, head of the Inquisition of the Calibration Church. He hadn't chased Dan through the forests. He'd been waiting here, in the cathedral, because he knew that sooner or later, the one who rules the system would come here, to the altar, to the central node, because there was nowhere else to go. Anselm looked at Dan, and Dan looked at Anselm, and saw his code, and froze. Because the Supreme Reader's code was unusual. It contained marks, dozens of marks, hundreds, traces of every heretic Anselm had tracked down in his lifetime, every diff he had ever sensed, all recorded, all archived. This man carried within him the memory of every heretic of the text from the past 40 years. And he looked at Dan with an expression Dan hadn't expected, not with rage, not with hatred, with weariness. The weariness of a man who had done the same job his whole life, and who now saw that it was meaningless. The square fell silent. 500 people, 37 fresh green windows, and 2 people looking at each other across the crowd. Anselm moved first. He walked slowly. The crowd parted before him like water. A black robe, a silver insignia, the Supreme Reader. People feared him more than any general, because a general could kill the body, a reader could erase the soul. He stopped 5 steps away from Dan. He looked, he studied, not with his eyes, with that sense that made him a reader. He read Dan like an open book, every diff, every trace, every edit Dan had ever made. Then he spoke. His voice was quiet, steady, without malice. He said that in 40 years of service, he had tracked down 11 heretics of the text. Each of them could touch the system, some crudely, some more subtly. Each thought he was special. Each thought he was the savior. And each ended up breaking more than he fixed. Because the system isn't meant for human hands. It's meant for God. Dan listened, didn't interrupt. Anselm continued, said he'd seen what Dan had done in the square. 37 edits in 10 minutes. Clean, precise, no side effects. None of his 11 predecessors had been capable of that. They broke things. Dan fixed them. And that frightened Anselm even more, because whoever can fix things can also break them, better than anyone. Dan spoke up. He said he wasn't going to break anything. He said the system was already broken, without his help. He said that the heresy of decay was neither a punishment nor a disease, that someone was deliberately breaking the system from within, in cycles, methodically, and that it wasn't him. Anselm was silent. He watched. Dan continued. He said he could see the world's code, that he could show Anselm what he couldn't see, that he could prove it. He held out his hand, not to attack, not to shake hands, to demonstrate. Anselm looked at the hand, at the open palm, at the classless boy from the village who was offering the church's supreme reader a chance to see the world through his eyes. Anselm didn't take his hand. Instead, he turned around. He looked at the cathedral, at the golden dome, at the doors through which he had emerged, and he said that Dan had 1 hour to prove his words. Then he would summon the garrison. Dan nodded. 1 hour. Enough. He looked at Celeste. She understood without words. She nodded. He looked at Hana. She nodded. At Irene. She nodded. At May and Thomas. Everyone. They entered the cathedral, the 6 of them, with Anselm. The cathedral was enormous inside. White stone, stained glass windows, columns rising into the darkness of the ceiling, and in the center, the altar, the calibration altar, a stone slab 2 meters by 2, covered with symbols that glowed with a soft, golden light. The system's central node. Dan could feel it from the threshold, like standing next to a running reactor. Power, depth, scale. Data from the entire region flowed through this node. Hundreds of thousands of statuses, millions of lines of code. Everything was here. Everything was accessible. Dan approached the altar. He placed his hands on the stone and immersed himself in the code. The regional level. He saw everything. Every status in the region. Every class. Every skill. Every glitch. And he saw traces. Traces of the second editor. Dozens, hundreds, scattered throughout the region. Purge marks. Nodes from 40 to 60. Cycle 3. Systematic and cold work. He pulled those traces to the surface, not with his eyes, with his hands. He unfolded the node log so Anselm could see them. The reader didn't see the code, but he felt the diffs, and now he felt them all, at once. Hundreds of foreign edits, cold, impersonal, methodical. Edits that weren't his, weren't Dan's, were someone else's. Anselm turned pale. He could feel it. For the first time in his life, he could feel the scale. Not individual diffs, the whole picture, the entire third cycle, all the tags, all the nodes, everything. Dan spoke while Anselm felt, explained, that the system wasn't divine law, that it was code, old, launched, unsupervised, that the heresy of decay wasn't a random glitch, that someone was dismantling it, purposefully, on schedule, that in a year or two, the 4th cycle would begin, and then everything would break. Anselm stood at the altar, hands down, eyes closed. He listened, not with words, with that sense that was both his curse and his gift. And what he heard destroyed everything he had believed in for 40 years. He opened his eyes, looked at Dan, quietly asked if he could stop it, if he could fix it. Dan said he could, but not piecemeal, not one person at a time. Through the altar, a mass hotfix. One commit for the entire region. All flags disabled, all classes reset, all victims of the decay within this node's radius. In a single stroke. Anselm asked what the cost would be. Dan said the diff would be massive, deafening. Every mage and every reader on the continent would feel it. Everyone would know what had happened here. Everyone would know that someone had tampered with the system. The church, the crown, the aristocracy, everyone. And the second editor would find out too. Anselm was silent for a long time. Then he dropped to his knees. Not before Dan, before the altar. Before the system he had served his entire life, and which turned out to be not a god, but a machine, an old, broken machine that someone had been taking apart piece by piece. He said one word, "Do it." Dan placed both palms on the altar. He closed his eyes and began. He found the pattern, that very activity flag that had been turned off for every victim of the decay. He wrote the condition, find all statuses in the region with the flag turned off. Verify that the class has not been deleted, but only deactivated. Turn on the flag. Restore connections if damaged. A simple condition, universal, applicable to all. He ran it. The altar flashed. Golden light flooded the cathedral. A wave spread from the node in all directions, through the walls, through the city, through the fields beyond the city, through the villages, through the forests. Dan felt the correction spreading. Hundreds of statuses, simultaneously. Scarlet windows flickered and flashed green, all over Olmar, all over the region. Hundreds of people instantly got their classes back, their skills, their lives, their names. He stood at the altar and held on. His hands were burning. His head was splitting. The code flowed in a torrent, correction after correction, status after status. He didn't count. He couldn't. Too much. Too fast. He just held on, like holding up a wall that's crumbling, with both hands, with everything he had. Celeste stood behind him and cried, not from pain, from beauty. She felt every correction, every healing, hundreds of simultaneous restorations, a wave of goodness radiating in circles from a single person. She said later that it was like hearing a symphony played by the whole world. Hana stood by the door, sword at the ready, in case anyone tried to enter and stop it. No one tried. Irene stood with her eyes closed and smiled, because she could feel it, how the decay was retreating, how the cracks were closing, how the world stopped rotting for a second. Not forever, but now, right now. It had gotten better. May stood next to Irene and held her hand, because Irene was staggering from the flood of sensations. Thomas sat on the floor and watched, memorizing, every detail, every face. The scout boy was doing what he did best, bearing witness. Dan was done. He took his hands away. He staggered. Celeste caught him. He stood and breathed, heavily. The world was spinning, but he stood. The altar was slowly fading, returning to its usual glow. And all over the city and beyond, people stood in the streets and in their homes and in the fields, looking at their windows, at the green windows, at the returned classes, at the resurrected destinies, and they didn't believe it, and they wept. Anselm knelt before the altar. He didn't move. He felt everything, every correction, every healing, and every one of those corrections he was duty-bound to call heresy. But he couldn't, because heresy doesn't heal. Heresy doesn't restore. Heresy doesn't fix. And this village boy had just fixed the world. And then a message popped up in Dan's field of vision. Not from the system, not from the node, not from the altar. A system message written by a hand he didn't recognize. But he recognized it, because he had seen that handwriting in the oldest comments in the world's code. The handwriting of the one who wrote the system. The message read, "Good commit, but you haven't seen yet how broken everything is." And the signature, Architect. Dan stood at the altar and looked at the message. The letters hung in the air, visible only to him. Good commit, but you haven't seen yet how broken everything is. Architect. He read it 3 times, then he reached for the message. Just as he reached for any code, his fingers reached in, and the message unfolded. Behind it was an address, not a physical one, a system one, coordinates within the system's architecture. Deep, deeper than the regional node, deeper than the altar, at the kernel level, where the world's source code lay. And next to the coordinates was a note, old, ancient, written in the same handwriting. The note read, "When you're ready, come, we have something to discuss." Dan closed the message. He turned to the others. Celeste looked at him with concern. She sensed that something had happened, something beyond the hotfix. Dan said later, "First, they had to deal with what was here." Anselm rose from his knees. His face was gray, aged in the last hour. He looked at Dan and said he needed time, said he wouldn't call in the garrison, said he wouldn't pursue them, but he said he couldn't protect them either. Because the church is more than just one reader, and word of what happened in the square and in the cathedral is already spreading. Messengers will ride to the capital. The calibration council will find out. In a week, maybe sooner. Dan nodded. A week. That's a long time, and not enough. Anselm looked at him again. Then he said something Dan hadn't expected. He said that among his readers there was a young woman, Sister Veronica, 23 years old, the best nose for diffs of anyone he'd ever seen, better than his own. She was part of the trio that had followed Dan from Crow Hall. Anselm said she was asking questions, uncomfortable questions, about the nature of her gift, about why she feels what she feels, about why the church treats with burning rather than healing. He said she was on the edge, between faith and doubt, and that if Dan met her first, maybe she wouldn't become an enemy. Dan remembered the name, Veronica. They left the cathedral. The square was empty. The guards were gone. The priest was gone. The boy healer sat on the edge of the platform, dangling his feet, a green window above his head, alive, unharmed. When he saw Dan, he jumped down, ran over, and stood before him without saying a word. He just stood there, his eyes full of something Dan couldn't name. Then the boy turned and ran away, into the alley, to his patients, to the people he treated because he could. Dan watched him go. Then they left, out of the city, along the northern road, 6 of them, fast, while Anselm kept his word, before the week was over. They walked all day, in silence, tired. Dan could barely move his legs. The mass hotfix had taken more out of him than he'd thought. His head was buzzing. Lines of code floated before his eyes. He saw them even with his eyes closed. They stopped by evening, in a grove on a hill, far from the roads. Hana lit a fire, the first in many days, because there was no point in hiding anymore. After what happened in the square, after the massive hotfix, every mage on the continent felt its diff. Every reader, every analyst, the whole world knew that in Olmar, someone had tampered with the system at a level no one had touched in 1,000 years. Hiding was pointless. Dan sat by the fire and told them about the message from the architect, about the coordinates in the core, about the invitation. Celeste listened with eyes ablaze. Coordinates in the system's core. It was what she had dreamed of her whole life. The world's source code, the first cause, the answer to the question she had asked 12 years ago and for which she had been destroyed. Irene listened in silence. Then she closed her eyes. She listened to the world. She opened them. She said she could sense the core, far away, to the south, right where the epicenter of the collapse was, right where the rumbling she'd heard since day one was coming from. The core and the source of the collapse were in the same place, or nearby, Dan thought. It made sense. If the second editor was breaking the world, then he was operating from the core, or near the core, where access was greatest, where he could launch cleansing cycles across the entire world. Hana asked when we were going. She didn't ask if we were going. She asked when. Dan looked at her, at the swordswoman who had lost everything 3 months ago, at the woman who held her sword even when the sword wouldn't, at the warrior who walked not because she knew where to go, but because she didn't know how to stand still. He looked at Celeste, at the scientist who had been right for 12 years and could now finally prove it, who walked toward the truth not for glory, but so that the world would stop lying to itself. He looked at Irene, at the girl who had been locked in a tower for 19 years and told she was a monster. But she turned out to be a beacon, the only tool that could show where it hurt. And she walked toward the pain, not away from it, toward it, because now she knew that pain was not a curse, but a diagnosis. I looked at May, the quiet girl with the empty window, who never chose a class, who walked beside them, helping and listening and learning, and who would one day choose for herself, when she was ready, not when the system decides, not when he decides, when she decides. He looked at Thomas, at the boy who had walked through the forest alone for 3 days, who led them when they didn't know the way, who remembered every word and every face, a witness, a chronicler, 10 years old and already more of a man than many adults Dan had known in both his lives, 5 of them. They were all looking at him. They were all waiting. He said tomorrow. Hana nodded. Celeste nodded. Irene nodded. May nodded. Thomas nodded. They went to bed. Except for Dan. He sat by the fire and thought about the path that had led him here, about the night on the barn roof, about his first encounter with the code, about Marion, who had cried when she saw her green window, about Crow Hall, about the 56 people, about Thornwood, about the alley where he found Irene, about the square in Olmar, about the boy doctor, about the 37 green flashes, about the hundreds of statuses restored through the altar, about Anselm's face, about Anselm's knees on the stone floor of the cathedral, about a good commit, but you haven't seen yet how broken everything is. He hadn't seen it, not yet, but he was going to see it. He was heading toward the core of the world, toward the source code, to the one who wrote it, or to what remained of him. He was going to the second editor who was methodically taking the world apart piece by piece and whose motives he didn't understand. He was going to the answer to the question that had tormented him since the night he came of age. Why him? Why exactly was he reborn in this world? Why exactly with an empty class? Why exactly with eyes that can see code? A coincidence? Or someone wrote a ticket and assigned it to the only developer who was available, because he was dead. Dan smiled, a crooked smile, tired, like the smile of a man who understands that his life and his death and his rebirth are neither a miracle nor a tragedy. It is a task assigned to him. He looked at the sleeping figures, at the 5 people who had followed him, not because he was strong, not because he was a hero, because he had fixed them, each in their own way. He restored Celeste's sense of right and wrong. He restored Irene's name. He restored Hana's hands. He gave May a choice. He gave Thomas a family. He didn't fight. He didn't win. He didn't conquer. He mended. And they followed him because in a world that had declared them a failure, he was the only one who said that there are no broken people. There are only mistakes that haven't been found yet. The bonfire was dying down. Stars hung overhead. Strangers. Unfamiliar. In 19 years, they had never become familiar. But now it didn't matter, because he was no longer the village outcast. He wasn't a mistake of the universe. He wasn't a bug. He was a companion, called to a dying system to keep it on its feet until a real solution was found. And tomorrow, he would get up and move on, to the core, to the code of the world, to the architect, to the truth, with 5 people behind him, with 2 hands, with 1 skill, and with a commit message he had already mentally written for what he was about to do. Refactoring, the fate module. The class's hard-coded binding to birth has been removed. The option to choose has been added. All tests are green. Merge. He closed his eyes, and for the first time in 2 lifetimes, he slept peacefully.